Every so often, a very special Aston Martin can come to market. One which is both almost unbelievable and unbearably desirable. A car which to those in the know evokes thoughts of what it might be like to drive and how did it come about, what of its historical context, and who was responsible for building it. The special and unique car I'd like to bring to your attention is as fascinating and thought-provoking as it is exciting. It is simply put, an ex-Aston Martin factory-built prototype, constructed and used in period to prove the then new, newly designed Tadek Marek V8 engine and a Dion rear suspension design. This astonishing DB5, chassis number 001DP, is a mythical beast, and surely the David Brown era classic Aston Martin that every devotee of the marque would like to get behind the wheel of. In trying to unravel the history and background of this original brute in a suit, we are immensely proud and honoured to be bringing you a conversation with the very man who between 1966 and 69 was responsible, with his team of engineer colleagues, for devising, engineering and building this former prototype under the roof of Aston Martin's Newport Pagnell Engineering and Experimental Department. Bill Bannard, when not on the welding gear and spanners, was also tasked with driving this very car, covering over 300 miles a day, improving not only the V8 engine, but engineering and testing the new Dion rear axle arrangement too. Both engineering developments which went on to be productionized later. Just some of the fascinating insight and facts we learnt from Bannard, who rose to become Director of Engineering at Aston Martin before his retirement, include knowing now that this prototype's mechanical configuration could well have been productionized and fitted in later variants of the DB6, had it not been for a late boardroom decision to first release the V8 engine and drivetrain in a new and larger car, appealing more to the growing American market. That car was yet to come and would become known as the DBS. We also learned that this experimental car was the very first prototype ever to have been built at the then new Newport Pagnell facilities, and that the unique chassis has a wheelbase measuring over 4 inches longer than a period production DB5. Unlike the V8 engine nestling under a slightly modified DB5 bonnet, it's difficult to spot the additional 4 inches in the wheelbase, but having measured it, wheel centre to wheel centre, that additional length is there. We're very privileged today to have a gentleman with us, Bill Bannard, who was with Aston Martin from 1963 to 1992, I think it was it Bill?
Indeed.
And in that time came through the ranks from working in the engineering department, is that right?
Experimental fitter.
Experimental, right. And in the latter years was a director of the company and had pivotal roles. But what makes it a special occasion is Bill was wholly responsible, I think, under the auspices of Tadek Marek, of building the car that we're looking at today, NPP, which is a prototype car, ex-factory, that was used for the development of several ideas, not least of which is the development of the V8 engine, also designed by Tadek Marek, and the Dion rear suspension arrangement, which in a different guise was carried on into the V8 cars throughout the 70s and 80s. Bill, seeing the car must bring back to you an awful lot of memories.
It does indeed, Nick. Good, bad and otherwise.
Yeah.
But no, I'm very fond of that car, even now.
Yeah. I can't see why you wouldn't be. It's a very special car. You've referred to it to me as your baby, and you must have one or two key memories of driving this car in its different guises. Maybe you could share one or two of those.
Yes, I think once we'd got the initial bedding in process completed, then I had the task of accumulating some mileage on the car as quickly as possible, and the aim was 350 miles a day, but without getting more than 50 or 60 miles from Newport Pagnell in case there were problems, which made sense. And of course I didn't really want to frequent anywhere too many times because generally I was doing a little bit more than the legal speed that was required. So,
well, I can understand that because you're testing for engine performance. But the one thing that probably a lot of people won't necessarily understand about this car is being a prototype car, pretty much everything about it is unique. Can you explain to me how this evolved? Was it a car that started life as a production car? Was it built up from scratch? How was it actually made in the first place? And I think you've said to me it was made at Newport Pagnell.
it was indeed. We took, or were given, the basic platform chassis of the current production cars. That came into our workshop and went on to our jig. The front end remained current, i.e. production, and the back end was removed.
Right, okay.
But well behind the central cross member.
The back end of the chassis?
Yes.
Yeah.
As it came into us, so that was taken off. And I don't remember any specific design drawings, but I'm sure there were schemes to give us the ability to create a rear end that would take both a new Dion suspension setup and also, as and when necessary, we could also take that away and put in the standard live axle rear end. So there was some deepish thought went into that back end to give us that facility, and indeed it was non-standard to a high degree, and in fact was on telescopic instead of the original dampers at the rear end, and it was never intended to prove the suspension, but it was definitely intended to prove the Dion.
Right, so to handle the power as well, I should
Indeed,
think,
yeah.
So tell me, on the front end, because the V8 engine is a completely different configuration to the straight six, what was needed on the front end of the car to get that V8 in there?
An awful lot of patience.
Right. Yeah.
No, there was a lad named Roger Date who was a great help to me because getting the exhaust system into 4 into 1 or 4 into 2 and 4 into 1 was a real humongous problem and difficulty, and that was the major problem.
But clearances in the engine bay and where the manifolds run down?
Very, very tight.
Yeah.
Very, very tight. And as was the way of the world at that time, Newport, we didn't have a bending machine. We obtained, and they came in 2 sacks of bends.
Okay, right.
And it literally was the first manifolds that we got on the car. Probably were 5, 6, maybe as many as 8 different pieces.
Well, welded all together.
Yes, and they held in place whilst they were tacked.
Okay, yeah.
And eventually taken off, which of course was also part of the problem because you had to get the damn things out again.
Yeah,
to
and then put them back in again.
Yeah, yeah.
Very good.
That was a major problem.
Yeah, yeah. So that's really interesting. So You put a lot of miles on the car, and as did Tadek Marek and Gershon and various other people within Aston Martin at the time. What was the overriding impression of everyone that drove it in the day?
Hard to say really, because the major thought was how good is the V8? How wonderful is the V8? What is the V8 going to do for us? And to a certain extent that masked the other abilities of the car to provide us information on how to avoid problems when the V8 came into production. And I'm specifically talking chassis, brakes, even the wheel hubs, size of the wheels, tyres. It gave us a lot of information on many other things, but the main interest in the car from people who weren't involved day to day was the V8.
Yeah.
And it was a very nice, docile motor, gave certainly 80 or so more horsepower than the current 6s, so could be quite exciting if pushed.
Yeah, interesting. And so in driving the car, I'm presuming there was very little in the way of ventilation and heating and cooling and so on and so forth. How was that when you were doing all those miles? Because we know how hot DB5s can get when you're sat in them in traffic on the M25. Must have been a challenge.
Yeah, it was, but one of which I thoroughly approved because it did two things. It relieved us of the problem of getting that sophistication into the car, so that was one problem less we had to worry about, all for that. And the other thing was it stopped many people wanting to borrow the car because they didn't want to have to deal with those problems.
And we talked a little earlier on, and you were explaining to me how this was actually the very first prototype that was ever built up and from the Newport Pagnell base, the Newport Pagnell being the new manufacturing facility coming on stream at that time. So given, I'm presuming, that there weren't that many people at Newport Pagnell at that time, what sort of, I mean, do you remember the numbers of people that were involved, apart from yourself, in the building of this car? Was this something that was done by half a dozen people or a few hundred, or how was that done?
The way Newport Pagnell worked was that we had the experimental employees within the department, no more than 6, 7. But we were always augmented by people from production.
Right.
Now, how they got selected, I don't know. But they would come into, we would take sheet metal workers specifically, and they were always really good. When needed, electricians, and they were good lads. The trim and any areas that were within the concept of production, it would either go into production and be done there and then come back into the into our workshop, or they would lend us the people to do the work. So probably up to 20 people involved to any extent, but the core was always the experimental people in the workshop.
Yeah, and so the car's built up and it's been used, and you've pounded on your 350 miles a day, as did other people as well. You have this logbook, which is a magnificent piece of history, because it logs the dates and the mileages and the amount of fuel used of everyone that drove it on different days. And I've had a brief skim of that, and the names in it are legends in themselves. So after this car being finished with, your baby, it got sold. How did that happen?
Being a mere experimental fitter, one did not get a handle on such wheeling and dealing. One had one's suspicions, but I don't know. I don't know. And bearing in mind, Nick, that I went on from, we always had 3 or 4 vehicles available to us for various work, sometimes major, sometimes minor. Not always belonging to us or allocated to us, but always vehicles around. But I went on subsequently to the V8 proper prototype.
The DBS.
The DBS, yes.
Yeah.
So once I was into that job, which was akin to this one, i.e. start from scratch, and get it built. I didn't lose interest in 7D, but my attention was wholly...
Sounds like job done.
Not really, because if one had to go somewhere and it was available, then you wanted a bit of fun.
So
what a nice way to enlighten the day.
Yeah, seeing the car go one day must have felt a bit of a loss, I would have thought.
I think I'd already left. I think.
Okay. This was when you went off to
DAF.
Yeah.
I don't actually remember seeing the car go. And,
how long was that at DAF?
Sorry?
How long were you at DAF?
About 5.5 years.
And then straight back to Newport?
No.
Or not? No?
No. This was the era where the oil crisis arose.
Of course, yeah.
The banks ran out of money. They clawed back Lex's borrowings. So the job that I was set up to go and do work for Volvo at Ipswich and their import centre was pulled. And I spent 5 or 6 months mulling over going back to Aston's because Mike Loseby had offered me a job.
Okay.
And Aston's having gone broke, I was not all that keen on jumping out of one fire into another one.
Interesting.
But I did.
Yeah. Okay. So now we're here today, and here's your car, your baby, some whatever it is, 50 or 60 years later. And I know we've had a little look at it. We know, well, actually, it's difficult to say is it the same as the day, because it's always been an experimental car and it's always changed. And like any experimental car, it will probably forever continue to evolve. But how do you feel having had just a little glance at it without? And I know this is going to be the engineer's way. Oh, well, that's not quite as I remember it, and that's not quite as I remember it. That's always going to be there. But just actually, how do you emotionally feel about seeing the car after so long?
I'm delighted to see it. I wish it enormously well. I want it to go on and on and on and on, because that's our legacy.
Yeah.
And to all those super guys at Newport Pagnell who gave an awful lot of their lives and effort to making cars, that legacy means a lot.
Yeah.
Certainly means a lot to me. So I'm very pleased to see it.
Yeah.
It would not have survived in its original form.
No.
Because it couldn't meet anybody's expectations or the regulations, indeed. So to see it nicely looked after, wonderfully presented, I'm pleased.
So one other thing that we've asked ourselves here, and we don't have the answer to, and you may do, Bill, taking yourself back to the day. The V8 engine being developed in this car, in the chassis of DB4, 5, 6 lineage. The DBS was some way off. Was the DBS something that was had originally been envisaged for the V8, or was the V8 thought of as an engine that could go into DB6?
I'm sure the original plan was for V8 to supersede the six-cylinder engine, not necessarily all at once, but probably as an option, etc., etc. You know how marketing works in this way. I think from the installation and the difficulties of the installation, lessons were learned, and I hesitate to say it in that fashion because it's, I think, obvious problems were shown up that would require quite a lot of redesign to make into a productionized, marketable product that held off the immediate move to the V8. And in the fullness of time, and I don't know how long that was, maybe 1 year, maybe 2, I would say probably 18 months or so after this started to show where this route was taking us, that the idea of a bigger, more substantial chassis to take the engine and the associated increase in power started to come to the fore.
Okay, so really the concept of the DBS, which is a bigger and wider car, really came after the V8, is what you're saying?
Indeed.
Yeah, interesting. So we might, if history had been different, have had DB6s with V8s and Dion axles if there hadn't been this thought process about going off into a bigger car, which naturally would suit perhaps bigger markets like the United States and so on. I think I've got that. And so lastly, and this is something that people will be interested to know, we're looking at a car here which is painted in Pacific blue, and we know Astons over the years have been painted in lots of different colours because that's part of what happens with Aston Martin. Was the car this colour from new?
Yes, it was. It was fully painted, but not polished.
Okay, off the gun.
Yes, off the gun. It was properly presentable, but it was never polished. It was never intended to be an attractive motor car. It was absolutely intended.
I suppose today
to merge.
You would see this in sort of zebra print and everything else.
And all that nonsense. Yes, yes.
Yeah, interesting. So, Bill, thank you very much for agreeing to come up and look at the car and have this conversation. I know you've travelled quite a distance, so I appreciate that very much. It's lovely to see you again after so many years, and I appreciate there's probably been a bit of a wrench seeing this car, but it's a big thank you from all of us here for agreeing to just be interviewed and answer a few little questions to satisfy our curiosity on your old baby.
It's been a pleasure, Nick. It's lovely to see all the cars, this one in particular, and in such a lovely setting. I envy the car. Such a nice place to be. How nice. And it warms my heart to know that it's being looked after as I would have wished it to be.
Well, that's good to know. Thank you very much indeed for your kind words.
You're welcome.
Restored over 20 years ago, driving this mythical beast is not only a privilege but also highly rewarding, with acres of torque and power, well-controlled suspension and brakes to match. The restorer's brief of making the car usable on a daily basis being well executed. To wonder what Aston Martin's future would have held had this car been productionized is of course fantasy, but nonetheless a deeply interesting thought. And now we are immensely proud to have found a new custodian for what must surely be described as an important part of Aston Martin's history. A true enthusiast, the new custodian owner we're delighted to have found spent a portion of his formative years living less than 15 miles from Newport Pagnell, and many of his Sundays peering over the fence surrounding the factory, fantasizing and wondering if one day he could own an Aston Martin of his own. His dream of owning one coming true some years later, adding 001 DP to his collection, has been a highlight in his collecting pursuit, and we look forward to seeing this provocative former prototype car at various concours and car events over the coming years.